The cantina on Station Nexus 7 buzzed with the usual evening crowd. Aliens from dozens of species filled the dimly lit space, their conversations mixing into a symphony of clicks, growls, and electronic translations. The air smelled of exotic drinks and the ozone from poorly maintained life support systems. Captain Vexatai raised his crystal glass high above his blue-skinned head. The tall Zephyrian's voice boomed across the cantina as he addressed his companions. "To the Galactic Council's latest joke," he declared, his four eyes gleaming with amusement. "The Human Restriction Decree." Laughter erupted from the table of traitors surrounding him. A crystalline diplomat named Shard Singer Velmoth clicked, his approval, the sound echoing from his translucent body. "I still cannot believe they actually passed it," Velmoth said, his voice like breaking glass. "Restricting an entire species because of a few minor incidents." Vextai took a long drink before continuing his performance. He hunched his shoulders and made his voice squeaky, mimicking what he thought humans sounded like. "Oh no, please do not hurt us. We are just peaceful explorers from Earth." The table burst into fresh laughter. A bulky Gorton merchant slammed his massive fist on the table, making the drinks jump. "Peaceful explorers who happened to destroy 3 pirate fleets last year," he rumbled through his translator. "Lucky shots?" Vextai waved dismissively. "Any species can get fortunate once or twice. These humans simply happened to catch some tired raiders off guard." Velmoth leaned forward, his crystalline features catching the cantina's colored lights. "The reports from the outer rim make them sound like monsters, ships appearing from nowhere, fighting like wild animals, refusing to surrender even when clearly beaten. Propaganda." Another Zephyrian traitor laughed. "The Council needs something to blame for their failures in the outer systems. Why not pick on the newest species to reach the stars?" Vextai stood up on his chair, addressing the entire cantina now. Several other patrons turned to listen, amused by the show. "Friends, we have all heard the stories. Humans are too dangerous. Humans are too unpredictable. Humans fight too hard." He paused for dramatic effect. "But what we really have here is a species barely out of their Stone Age, flying around in ships held together with metal tape and hope." The crowd roared with approval. Even aliens from other tables were nodding and chuckling now. "I have seen their vessels," Vextai continued. "Crude things with no style, no elegance. They paint them in boring colors and give them names like liberty and freedom and other primitive concepts." He made exaggerated gestures as he spoke. "They probably still use chemical rockets to get into orbit." A Nexari bartender, his 6 arms, working to clean glasses while he listened, called out from behind the bar. "What about the Scorvin incident? The whole fleet disappeared." Vextai waved his hand dismissively. "Space anomaly. Maybe a solar flare. The Scorvin were known for taking foolish risks. They probably flew too close to a black hole." "Or maybe," Velmoth added with his glass-breaking laugh, "they died of boredom listening to human surrender speeches." The cantina exploded with laughter, again. Even the serious-looking hegemony officials at the back tables were smiling now. "You know what I think?" Vextai jumped down from his chair and began pacing dramatically. "I think we should capture some of these humans. Keep them as pets. They could be entertaining. Teach them tricks. Make them dance," someone shouted from the crowd. "Make them fight each other for our amusement," another voice called out. Vextai nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Instead of banning them, we should be farming them. I bet their primitive brains could learn simple commands. Sit, stay, roll, over, surrender immediately." The laughter was deafening now. Aliens were pounding tables and making sounds that passed for applause in their respective cultures. The whole cantina seemed to be enjoying the show. In the far corner, almost hidden in shadow, a figure sat alone at a small table. He had been there for hours, nursing the same drink and listening to everything. His clothes were dark and worn, and several scars marked his face. Most of the patrons had not even noticed him. But now, as the laughter reached its peak, his hands tightened. Around his glass, the knuckles went white with pressure. "The funniest part," Vextai continued, clearly enjoying his role as entertainer, "is that they actually think they are warriors. They have movies about their great battles and heroes. But when was the last time they fought a real war? Against a real enemy? Never, Velmoth clicked. They spent their whole history fighting each other with sticks and stones. Now they think they can handle civilized warfare. Civilized warfare, Vextai repeated, savoring the words. That is the key phrase, friends. We fight with honor, with rules, with proper technology. He gestured grandly around the cantina. These humans probably still throw rocks at their enemies. The scarred figure in the corner slowly pushed back. His chair. The metal leg scraped against the floor, but the sound was lost in the continuing laughter. I propose a toast. Vextai raised his glass again. To the Galactic Council for protecting us from the terrible threat of human rock throwing. Every glass in the cantina rose in response. The laughter was so loud that the station's security systems registered it as a potential riot. The man in the corner stood up fully now. He was shorter than most of the aliens present, and his simple clothes marked him as someone of little importance. But there was something in the way he moved that suggested controlled violence. To keeping the galaxy safe from primitive mammals, Velmoth added to the toast. To the human restriction decree, the crowd shouted together. To never having to deal with their pathetic surrender speeches, Vextai concluded. As the aliens drank their toast, the scarred human began walking toward their table. His footsteps were quiet but steady. Several patrons glanced at him as he passed, but most were too busy laughing to pay attention. The man reached Vextai's table just as the Zephyrian was starting another joke about human cowardice. He stood there silently for a moment, waiting. Vextai noticed him first. Well, what do we have here? The Zephyrian looked the human up and down with obvious amusement. Let me guess. You are here to tell us we are wrong about your species? Going to make some brave speech about human courage? The human said nothing. He just stood there, his scarred face calm, but his eyes holding something that made a few of the smarter aliens suddenly uncomfortable. I am Commander Jake Murphy, the human finally said, his voice quiet but clear. And I think you should all shut up and listen to what really happened to the Scorvan. The cantina fell silent. Jake Murphy stood beside Vextai's table, his presence somehow filling the space despite his small size compared to most aliens present. The scars on his face told stories that nobody wanted to hear, but everyone suddenly needed to know. Vextai recovered first, his blue skin darkening with annoyance. Commander, is it? Of what army? What grand human fleet? He gestured to his companions, trying to restart the laughter. Let me guess. You command a garbage scow, with delusions of grandeur. Jake pulled out an empty chair and sat down without invitation. The metal groaned under his weight, and several aliens noticed the chair was reinforced military standard, not civilian furniture. I was the colony defense coordinator for Kepler 442b, Jake said simply. Population 50,000. Men, women, children. Farmers, teachers, engineers, doctors, people who just wanted to build something new. Velmoth's crystalline body flickered with uncertain light. Kepler colony. That was in the news reports. Scorvan raid, they said. Not a raid. Jake's voice remained steady, but his hands never moved far from his belt. An invasion. Full war. Fleet. 15 heavy cruisers, 40 destroyers, over 200 landing craft. He paused to take a sip of his drink. Warlord Grakthol's personal armada. A hegemony official from the back tables had moved closer to listen. The report said it was a minor skirmish, no casualties. Jake looked at the official with eyes that had seen too much. The reports were wrong. Vextai leaned back in his chair, still trying to maintain his superior attitude. So tell us, Commander, how did your mighty human colony defeat this terrible invasion? Did you throw rocks really, really hard? The cantina waited. Even the background music seemed to quiet down. Jake began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of memory. The first ships appeared on a Tuesday morning. Local time was about 7:30. Kids were getting ready for school. Parents were heading to work. Normal day in a normal place. He stared at his drink as he continued. My daughter Emma was eating breakfast. arguing with her mother Lisa about some homework she forgot to finish. Emma was 8 years old. She had my eyes and her mother's laugh. Something in Jake's tone made several aliens shift uncomfortably in their seats. The orbital sensors picked up the fleet at 7:45. Massive signatures, coming in fast and not responding to communication attempts. I was in my office reviewing supply reports when the alert came through. Jake's hands tightened slightly around his glass. Protocol said we had maybe 6 hours before they reached optimal attack position. Enough time to evacuate if we moved fast. So we started the emergency procedures. Vextai opened his mouth to make another joke, but something in Jake's expression made him close it again. The colony had one transport ship capable of carrying everyone, the Mayflower. Old cargo hauler converted for passenger service. Not fast, not pretty, but it could hold 50,000 people if we packed them in tight. Jake looked up from his drink. The problem was getting everyone to the spaceport and loaded before the Scorvan arrived. A Nexari patron called out from across the cantina. Why not just surrender? Scorvan usually offer terms to colonies. Jake's laugh was bitter and short. The Scorvan don't take prisoners. They take slaves. The healthy ones anyway. The old, the sick, the very young. He paused. They feed those to their war beasts. The cantina was completely quiet now. Even the bartender had stopped cleaning glasses. We had 4 hours to move 50,000 people across 200 kilometers of rough terrain. Families, elderly folks, newborn babies. People who had never been in an emergency situation in their lives. Jake continued his story without emotion, like he was reading from a report. The evacuation went better than we hoped. People stayed calm, helped each other, followed instructions. The transport pilots pushed their shuttles beyond safe limits to get everyone moved faster. By the time the Scorvan entered orbit, we had 49,800 people packed into the Mayflower. Velmoth's voice was quieter now. What about the other 200? Volunteers, Jake said simply. People who stayed behind to buy time for the evacuation. Make sure the Scorvan could not catch the transport before it reached the hyperspace limit. 200 against an entire invasion fleet? The hegemony official sounded incredulous. That is suicide. Jake nodded slowly. Yes, it was. The silence stretched longer this time. Jake seemed lost in memory, seeing things the aliens could not imagine. The Scorvan started their bombardment at 14:30 hours. Standard orbital strike pattern. They were not trying to destroy the colony completely. They wanted the infrastructure intact for their own use. Jake's voice became clinical, professional. But they needed to eliminate any possible resistance first. What kind of weapons did you have? Vextai asked quietly. His earlier mockery was completely gone. Mining charges, construction equipment, some hunting rifles, a few old military surplus items from Earth's colonial expansion period. Jake shrugged. Nothing designed for real combat. Nothing that could seriously threaten Scorvan battle armor. Then how did you fight? Velmoth was leaning forward now, his crystalline form bright with curiosity. Jake met his eyes. We improvised. He started describing the preparations. How? Pete Williams, the head engineer, jury-rigged mining explosives into anti-personnel devices. How Linda Torres stripped the armor plating from construction mechs and welded it onto civilian vehicles. How Dr. Sam Roberts set up a field hospital in an old warehouse, knowing he would probably die treating wounded fighters. The Scorvan sent down their first wave at sunset. 500 warriors in full battle armor supported by hover tanks and gunships. Jake's voice grew distant again. They expected to secure the colony in under an hour. What happened? Someone whispered from across the cantina. Jake looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as he could. We said no. The simple words carried more weight than any grand speech could have managed. The Scorvan demanded our surrender over the colony, communication system. Their translator made Grekthol sound very polite about it. Very reasonable. Lay down your weapons, and death would be quick for the adults. The children would be treated well. Jake's hands were steady as he took another drink, but several aliens noticed the glass was cracking under the pressure of his grip. We sent back a message. One word. Same word in every human language we could think of. English, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, Hindi. Just to make sure they understood clearly. The cantina held its breath. Jake smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. No. Jake's words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The aliens around him waited, but he seemed lost in memory again. Finally, Velmoth's crystalline voice broke the silence. What happened next? Jake focused on the present again. The ground assault began at dawn. First light on the second day. 500 Scorvan warriors, each one 3 meters tall and armed with plasma rifles that could punch through starship armor. He paused. They came expecting to mop up whatever cowards were still hiding in the ruins. Vextai leaned forward, despite himself. How many of you were left? 197. Jake's voice was matter-of-fact. We lost 3 people to the orbital bombardment. Maria Santos took shrapnel trying to save some medical supplies. Ben Carter had a heart attack during the evacuation. Young Alex Brooks got caught in a building. Collapse. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the automated systems seemed to have quieted. The Scorvan came in standard formation. Heavy armor in front, infantry support behind, air cover overhead. Textbook assault tactics. Jake almost smiled. They had studied human military doctrine from our public databases. They knew exactly how we were supposed to fight. But you did not fight the way you were supposed to, the hegemony official guessed. No. Jake's expression grew harder. We fought the way humans always fight when we have nothing left to lose. He began describing the battle in clinical detail. The Scorvan heavy armor advancing through the colony's main street, expecting organized resistance from defensive positions. Instead, they found silence and apparently empty buildings. The first ambush happened at the marketplace. Pete Williams had spent all night rigging mining charges under the street surface. When the lead tank reached the center of the square, we turned 50 meters of road into a crater. Jake's hands moved slightly as he spoke, unconsciously demonstrating tactics to his alien audience. While they were dealing with the explosion, Linda Torres came at them from the side with her improvised combat vehicles. Construction mechs with welded armor plating and industrial cutting lasers. Not military grade, but they did not need to be military grade. Vextai found his voice again. You fought their tanks with construction equipment? Mining equipment, construction gear, anything with armor and weapons. Jake nodded. The Scorvan were expecting human soldiers with human tactics. They were not ready for humans with human ingenuity. He continued the story. How Maria Santos had positioned herself in the colony's water tower with a hunting rifle, picking off Scorvan officers at impossible distances. How old Ben Carter, a retired veteran from Earth's border wars, turned the colony's greenhouse into a fortress and held off 30 warriors with nothing but agricultural chemicals and improvised explosives. The twins, Amy and Alex Brooks, knew every maintenance tunnel and service duct in the colony. They spent the first day of the siege moving through the underground systems, setting traps and appearing behind enemy lines. Jake's voice carried a note of pride. Amy was 17. Alex was 16. They killed more Scorvan warriors than some planetary defense forces manage in full campaigns. The aliens listened in fascination and growing horror as Jake described the fighting. Humans using industrial equipment as weapons. Civilians becoming soldiers overnight. People who had never fired a shot in anger learning to kill with tools and determination. By the end of the first day, the Scorvan had taken the marketplace and 2 residential blocks. It should have been the entire colony. Jake took another drink. They lost 47 warriors and 3 hover tanks. We lost 12 people. How long did the siege last? Velmoth asked quietly. 8 days. Jake's voice was steady, but several aliens noticed the slight tremor in his hands. 8 days of fighting from house to house, room to room. The Scorvan kept sending reinforcements, but they could not understand what was happening. He explained how the human defenders adapted their tactics constantly, using the colony's manufacturing equipment to build new weapons overnight, reprogramming maintenance robots to carry explosives, converting the hospital's medical scanners into targeting systems for improvised artillery. On the 4th day, Warlord? Grakthul himself came down to assess the situation. His commanders were reporting impossible losses from a handful of barely armed colonists. Jake smiled grimly. He could not accept that humans were really that dangerous. The cantina patrons were completely absorbed now. Even the bartender had abandoned his cleaning to listen. Grakthul brought down his personal guard. 50 of the best Scorvan warriors in the galaxy, armed with the finest weapons money could buy. He was going to end this embarrassing resistance, once and for all. Jake paused to look around the cantina. That was his first mistake. What was his second? Someone asked from the crowd. He underestimated Linda Torres. Jake's voice carried genuine warmth for the first time. Linda was a maintenance engineer, 62 years old, grandmother of 4. She spent 30 years keeping fusion reactors running in deep space mining operations. The aliens waited for him to continue. On the 7th day, while Grakthul was planning his final assault, Linda was down in the colony's power plant making modifications to the main reactor. Jake's expression grew distant again. Not to overload it, not to cause an explosion, something much more interesting. Vexite was leaning forward now, his blue skin pale with anticipation. What did she do? She turned our fusion reactor into the galaxy's largest electromagnetic pulse generator. Jake's voice was calm, but his eyes were bright with remembered satisfaction. When the Scorvan launched their final attack, Linda activated her modification. The silence in the cantina was absolute. Every piece of Scorvan technology within 50 kilometers stopped working. Their plasma rifles became expensive clubs. Their battle armor became metal coffins. Their hover tanks fell out of the sky like stones. Jake looked directly at Vextai. Their communications, their sensors, their life support systems, all dead. Several aliens were making small sounds of amazement or horror. The EMP pulse lasted exactly 37 seconds. When it ended, we had 500 Scorvan warriors on the ground, trapped in powerless armor, armed with weapons that would not fire. Jake's smile was terrible to see. And we still had our knives. The cantina erupted in shocked whispers and nervous sounds. Jake waited for quiet before continuing. What happened next was not a battle. It was not warfare as civilized species understand it. His voice became very quiet. It was what humans do when someone threatens our families. Jake's words seemed to suck the oxygen from the cantina. The aliens around him sat frozen, afraid to ask what came next but unable to look away. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. The Scorvan warriors were trapped inside their own armor. Jake continued, his voice never rising above conversational level. Their suits had powered joints, environmental systems, targeting computers. Without power, they could barely move. They certainly could not fight effectively. Vextai swallowed hard, his throat making a clicking sound. What did you do to them? Jake met his eyes directly. We killed them all. The simple statement hit the cantina like a physical blow. Several aliens made distressed sounds. A few pushed back from their tables as if distance could protect them from what they were hearing. 137 humans against 500 helpless enemies, Jake said matter-of-factly. It took 6 hours. 6 hours? Velmoth's crystalline form was flickering rapidly. To kill 500 warriors? To kill them properly. Jake's expression never changed. You have to understand, these were not soldiers dying in combat. These were the beings who had spent 8 days trying to murder our neighbors, our friends, our families. People we had eaten dinner with, worked beside, loved. He paused to take a drink, giving the aliens time to absorb his words. Maria Santos found the Scorvan who had killed her husband during the first day's fighting. She spent 20 minutes with him before he died. Pete Williams took apart the warriors who had destroyed his workshop piece by piece, the way he would dismantle a broken machine. Jake's voice remained calm and professional. Linda Torres used her engineering tools on Warlord Grakthul himself. A Nexari patron near the bar made a retching sound and stumbled toward the exit. Several other aliens looked queasy. I need you to understand something, Jake said, addressing the entire cantina now. We were not soldiers. We were not trained killers. We were farmers and teachers and mechanics and doctors, normal people who wanted normal lives. He stood up from his chair, and several aliens automatically moved away from him. But we were also parents protecting our children, husbands and wives defending our families, human beings who had watched our neighbors die for no reason except that some alien warlord thought we would be easy prey. Jake walked slowly around the cantina as he spoke, his presence making everyone nervous. The Scorvan had studied our military tactics. They knew about human weapons and human technology and human strategies, but they had never bothered to learn about human nature. He stopped in front of Vextai's table again. That was their fatal mistake. The reports, the hegemony official said weakly. The official report said there were no survivors from the Scorvan force. That is correct. Jake nodded. No survivors, no prisoners, no wounded left behind. When we were finished, we fed the bodies to the colony's recycling systems. The cantina was deadly quiet. Even the station's background noise seemed muted. But that was not the end of the story, Jake continued. 3 days later, a Scorvan rescue fleet arrived, 12 heavy cruisers sent to investigate why Grakthol's force had gone silent. Vextai found his voice again, though it was much quieter than before. What happened to them? Jake smiled, and several aliens flinched at the expression. By then we had functional Scorvan weapons and armor. We had their communication codes and tactical frequencies. And we had learned some very interesting things about Scorvan ship systems. He began describing the trap they set for the rescue fleet, how they used captured Scorvan equipment to send false signals, luring the ships into orbit one at a time. How Linda Torres had modified their industrial, mining equipment to launch improvised missiles at the unsuspecting vessels. The Scorvan captains thought they were receiving distress calls from Grakthol's survivors. They came down in small groups, trying to be careful and professional. Jake's voice carried grim satisfaction. We picked them off one ship at a time. A Tide mining colony destroyed 12 military cruisers. Velmoth sounded incredulous. Not destroyed, captured, Jake corrected him. We needed their ships to evacuate the colony. Our original transport had been damaged in the fighting. The implications of this statement slowly sank into the aliens' minds. You mean, Vextai said slowly, that 137 humans captured an entire Scorvan battle fleet? 129, Jake corrected quietly. We lost 8 more people taking the ships. But yes. By the end of the second week, we had control of 12 heavy cruisers and all their support vessels. He sat back down at the table, but his presence still dominated the cantina. The evacuation took another 3 days. We had to make sure all the evidence was properly disposed of, clean up the colony, make it look like a natural disaster had occurred. Jake's voice became businesslike again. The official reports blame a reactor explosion for destroying the settlement. What about the missing fleets? The hegemony official asked. Space is big and dangerous. Ships disappear all the time. Pirates, asteroid storms, navigation errors. Jake shrugged. The Scorvan leadership decided that Grakthol had probably encountered some natural hazard. They wrote off the losses and moved on to easier targets. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Heavier, more thoughtful. That was not the only incident, Jake said finally. Similar events happened across human space over the next 2 years. Port Victoria, New Edinburgh, Ross Station, dozens of other colonies and settlements. He looked around the cantina, meeting as many alien eyes as possible. Each time the pattern was the same. Pirates or raiders or warlords would attack what looked like easy human targets, and each time they would simply disappear. No survivors, no witnesses, no explanation. Vextai's voice was barely a whisper. How many? The official count is over 40 separate incidents. Hundreds of enemy ships. Thousands of alien warriors. Jake's expression was grim. All gone without a trace. The cantina patrons looked at each other nervously, beginning to understand what they were really hearing. The Galactic Council started getting reports from their intelligence services. Disturbing patterns in the disappearances. All the missing fleets had one thing in common. Jake paused for emphasis. Their last known positions were near human colonies. That is when they began the investigation that led to the human restriction decree, the hegemony official said quietly. Jake nodded. That is when they finally started asking the right questions. Not about human military capabilities or human technology or human political intentions. He stood up again, preparing to leave. They started asking about human psychology. Jake moved toward the cantina exit but stopped when he reached the center of the room. Every alien eye was fixed on him, and he seemed to feel the weight of their attention. He turned back to address the entire crowd. The council's investigation took 8 months, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent space. They interviewed survivors from dozens of species, pirates who had encountered human ships and lived to tell about it, merchants who had witnessed human responses to threats, military officers who had tried to intimidate human colonies. Vextai found his voice again, though it was much weaker than before. What did they learn? Jake looked directly at the Zephyrian, Captain. They learned that humans do not fight the same way other species fight. Most civilized races have rules for warfare, acceptable losses, reasonable surrender terms, logical cost-benefit analysis. He walked slowly back toward Vextai's table, his footsteps the only sound in the cantina. Humans have only one rule when someone threatens what we love. No prisoners, no quarter, no mercy, no surrender. Jake's voice grew quieter but somehow more intense. We fight until either we win completely or we die completely. There is no middle ground. The hegemony official cleared his throat nervously. Surely that cannot be literally true. Every species has survival instincts. Jake smiled grimly. 3 years ago, a pirate fleet attacked the human research station at Wolf 359. 15 scientists and their families. No military forces. No defensive weapons. Just researchers studying stellar phenomena. He paused to let the aliens imagine the scene. The pirates demanded the station's valuable research data and threatened to kill hostages if the humans did not comply immediately. Standard intimidation tactics that work on every known species. What happened? Velmoth asked, though his crystalline form was dim with dread. Dr. Richard Hayes, the station commander, activated the facility's self-destruct sequence instead. Jake's voice was matter-of-fact. He gave the pirates exactly 30 seconds to leave the system before he detonated the station's fusion reactor. Several aliens made shocked sounds. The pirates thought he was bluffing. No rational being would sacrifice themselves and their families over research data. Jake shrugged. Dr. Hayes was not bluffing. The explosion took out 6 pirate ships and created a small nebula that is still expanding today. The cantina was silent except for the sound of nervous breathing from various species. That incident was reported to the council as a reactor accident, but the investigating team found Dr. Hayes's personal log entries, his final message to his wife on Earth, his instructions to his children about how to remember him. Jake's expression grew distant. There was no doubt about what really happened. Jake walked over to the bar and set his empty glass down. The Nexari bartender flinched away from him as if he were radioactive. The council started reviewing every human incident with new understanding. The colony ship that destroyed itself rather than let pirates board. The freight convoy that fought a running battle for 6 months instead of surrendering valuable cargo. The mining station that held off a siege for 3 years, eating recycled waste and drinking filtered urine, because giving up meant abandoning their families on the surface. He turned back to face the crowd of aliens. Do you know what the council's xenopsychology experts concluded? Jake asked. They decided that humans are the only known species that will choose extinction over submission. The only race that considers death preferable to defeat. Vextai was staring at his drink now, unable to meet Jake's eyes. That cannot be a sustainable survival strategy. It is not, Jake agreed. Humans have nearly destroyed themselves dozens of times throughout their history. Wars that killed millions, plagues that wiped out entire civilizations, environmental disasters caused by their own stubbornness and refusal to compromise. Hesir moved closer to Vextai's table again. But somehow humans always survive, because there is always someone willing to fight when everyone else wants to surrender. Always someone willing to pay any price to protect what matters. Jake's voice grew hard. And when those people are pushed to their limits, they become more dangerous than any weapon the galaxy has ever seen. The silence stretched until it became painful. Finally, a voice from the back of the cantina spoke up. Why tell us this story? What do you want from us? Jake looked toward the speaker, an elderly Gorton merchant who had been quiet throughout the evening. I want you to understand something. The human restriction decree is not about protecting the galaxy from human aggression. It is not about stopping human expansion or limiting human technology. Jake's voice carried absolute conviction. It is about protecting you from discovering what humans become when they have nothing left to lose. He walked toward the cantina's exit, but paused at the doorway. Every species in this cantina tonight has surrender protocols, rules for when continued fighting becomes pointless, rational calculations about acceptable losses and reasonable terms. Jake looked back at the crowd of silent aliens. Humans do not. Vextai finally found the courage to speak. What happens if someone ignores the restrictions? If they attack human settlements anyway? Jake's smile was colder than deep space. Ask the Scorvan. Oh wait, you cannot. There are no Scorvan left to ask. The implications of this statement rippled through the cantina like a shockwave. Several aliens began making urgent calculations on their personal devices, cross-referencing star charts and incident reports. The restriction zones around human space are not borders, Jake continued. They are warnings. They mark the distance you need to maintain if you want to remain civilized beings, if you want to keep believing that intelligent life is inherently rational and peaceful. He stepped through the doorway, but his voice carried back into the cantina. Cross those lines, threaten human families, and you will discover that intelligence and rationality are luxuries humans abandon the moment someone they love is in danger. Jake disappeared into the station's main corridor, leaving behind a cantina full of aliens who suddenly understood why their governments had voted unanimously for the human restriction decree. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The weight of what they had heard settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Finally, Vextai pushed his drink away and stood up slowly. I think, he said quietly, I need to review my shipping routes, make sure they stay well away from the restricted zones. Similar conversations began breaking out across the cantina. Merchants checking their trade schedules, military officers recalculating patrol boundaries, diplomats making urgent communications to their home governments. The party atmosphere was completely gone. In its place was a new understanding of why some species earn their reputation, not through conquest or technology, but through their absolute refusal to yield when protecting what they love. Outside in the corridor, Jake Murphy walked toward the transport docks. Behind him, the galaxy continued its ancient dance of politics and trade and civilized warfare, but now it danced around a species that played by different rules entirely. And in the darkest corners of space, where pirates and raiders planned their next attacks, word was already spreading. The yellow warning zones on the star charts were not suggestions. They were promises of what would happen to anyone foolish enough to threaten a human family. Some lessons, the galaxy was learning, were worth teaching only once.